Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Naruto to Boruto Shinobi Striker for PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. What you're seeing here is the PlayStation 4 version. This is a 3D fighting game developed by Soleil Limited and published by Bandai Namco in August of last year for all of the platforms, and it went on to get a pretty mixed reception overall, both from critics and from the general user base, and especially so on PC, where numerous technical problems severely hold the game back. There's also a very small player count on PC, so you basically can't get into online matches at all, and considering this is a primarily online game, that's a pretty significant problem. Of course, I played the PS4 version, and it seems like that's the version they put the most effort into, so you're not going to run into problems with lower player counts on that, and you're not going to run into quite as many server problems on PS4 either, although it does still have some technical issues of its own that I'll describe more in a moment. Of course, regardless of which version you're playing, what you've got here is a primarily online game, but it does have single player and co-op, and it's styled a lot after something like Dragon Ball Xenoverse. Now, if you've seen my reviews of Dragon Ball Xenoverse 1 and 2, you would know that the first game in that series had a pretty messy start, and then Xenoverse 2 improved a lot on what Xenoverse 1 did, and actually ended up being a pretty decent game overall. So, did they maybe learn from some of the things that Xenoverse did before making this? Or did something else entirely happen? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is definitely not really this game's strong suit. It is highly stylized anime visuals that are very reminiscent of something along the lines of the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, but even though it is highly stylized and often rather flashy, what you've got here is really nothing impressive in terms of visual quality. Obviously the texture quality is not particularly great, but it doesn't really need to be when it's all cel-shaded like this. But the modeling is perfectly serviceable, the animations are generally rather smooth and flow together very well, and all of that does fit in very well with what you see from the anime. So they've at least got the style down, but then there's the weird parts of the presentation, the things like the odd clipping that you might notice from time to time, or most notably the severe performance drops that are actually rather frequent. And I'm not entirely sure why, because again, the game isn't exactly some sort of visual powerhouse, and even though you do have some pretty decently sized maps, they're not especially detailed. They're just big open arenas for you to run around in. So it's not really like the game should be pushing the PS4 hardware at all, but at the same time, I still did notice numerous frame rate drops well below even 20 frames per second sometimes. And while some of it was during moments where you would almost expect more performance issues, like with a lot of particle effects happening on screen at the same time, some of it just seemed completely random. So that's definitely an issue, and I'm frankly surprised they haven't fixed it yet, considering the game's been out for a year now. But barring that and a few other mild glitches here and there, they've generally done a pretty decent job with the visuals. It's just that they definitely could have done more with it. And then you move over into sound design, and it's all very fitting for what you would expect from the Naruto anime. The sound effects are all pretty much spot on for the source material. A lot of the voice cast from the anime does return both in English and in Japanese, because you do have the option to switch between both languages. And obviously the Japanese voices are going to be better, but you don't get subtitles on everything like you do in some other games, so that is something to keep in mind. And the music, while not directly ripped from the anime, is definitely in keeping with the anime's style, which was a fairly unique style of music. So they definitely got that going for them, and overall the sound design is very consistent and actually rather strong. So when you bring the presentation as a whole together, even though it's not exactly impressive, it still does a good job of emulating the source material that it's based on. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although that actually ends up being a pretty significant problem for this game because there is no story. I mean, the game has a premise, but there's no actual story here. There's no actual story missions or anything of that nature. And what you end up with is just the basic setup of you're a ninja who has gone to Konoha in order to compete in the Ninja World Tournament. And that's it. It's a pretty flimsy setup, and the lack of a single-player campaign does ultimately mean that the single player in this is really just playing the co-op missions by yourself. And while that's not the biggest issue on the lower ranked missions, which are D and C, and then the middle ranked missions, which are B ranked, it is a noticeable problem on the A and S ranked missions, where it's painfully obvious they did not design those with even the slightest inkling that someone would try to play them solo. The higher the difficulty of a mission, the more enemies it's going to throw at you, and the higher health they have, and more damage they're going to do to you. On top of that, the interval between when they can cast jutsu is lowered, so eventually you'll hit the point where they can can basically just spam their jutsu over and over and over again in extremely short order, whereas you're sitting there on a 10 to 20 second cooldown on some of yours. Now this may not sound like that much of an issue to you because all of the missions that you're doing this in can be played in co-op, but then there's one particular factor that is going to absolutely ruin the experience for you on the higher difficulty missions, which is the time limit. There is a time limit on every single mission in this game, and it extends once you complete objectives within that particular mission. On the lower difficulty missions, it's really not a problem. You can play through those in very short order and get through them with tons of time to spare. But the higher difficulty you go, the more narrow that margin's gonna get, until eventually you hit the A and the S rank missions, where you will very frequently hit the time limit before you've completed the objective. Now, I'm sure there's some of you out there who'll just be like, oh, well, you just need to get good, or just play it in co-op. Well, that doesn't always remedy the situation. Because for one, the time limit is in every single mission, regardless of how much sense that makes. I mean, for example, there are missions that require you to defend the village gates, and you would think that the time limit would be the amount of time you have to hold out, except it's not. You have to defeat all of the waves in that time limit. And obviously the time limit gets extended every single time you finish a wave, but even then, if you've got a time limit for defense, it should be, once the timer runs out, the mission's a success, right? Except it's not. It's that sort of illogical design that makes certain missions incredibly frustrating to play through, even if you're playing it in co-op, because you may go into a mission, and there may be only one specific way you can actually win that mission, which may seem completely counterintuitive. So that's just not fun for anybody involved. And while it's definitely more tolerable to play those missions in co-op, unfortunately those being the only single-player content in the game make it a very frustrating experience to deal with. But obviously the game is really designed more around its online play than anything else, so you might hop over into that, and you'll find that there are two basic modes of going into online versus. There's Quick Match, and then there's the Ninja World League. And the Ninja World League is only going to be 2 game modes at any time, and it's going to cycle between them on the various maps, and the Quick Play is going to be available for all 4 of the game modes that are available in the game, except that I'd never managed to get any of the modes that weren't already in the Ninja World League. Which is to say that out of the 4 modes available in the game, which are Barrier, Base, Combat, and Flag, I was only able to get Combat and Flag. And while I could always get into a Ninja World League match in pretty short order, unfortunately when I went into Quick Match, it took me over 10 minutes to find a game. And that was during primetime on weekends, and I assume it's because the Ninja World League actually gives you various rewards for actually playing it and gradually ranking up in it, as opposed to the Quick Match mode, which doesn't. So to give you a quick rundown on the modes, the base battle mode is basically just domination. You have 3 points on the map, you capture the points. As long as you hold those points, then you gradually earn points for your team. Once you've maxed out the bar for your points, then you win the match. And obviously the enemy team can recapture those bases in order to earn points for their team as well. So it's pretty straightforward, very basic mode. Flag battles are just your basic capture the flag mode, where each team has a flag at their base, and when the enemy team manages to take that and bring it back to their base, they score a point. 2 points win the match, and of course the carrier of the flag can drop that flag by being hit several times, and the team can return that flag to their base. Like with the base battle mode, it's a pretty standard, very basic mode. This mentality of very basic, very standard also extends to the combat mode, which is basically just team deathmatch, and once you eliminate a certain number of the enemy team, then you win the match. In fact, the only mode that's actually kind of different is the barrier mode, where the defending team is ultimately trying to prevent the attacking team from raising various stakes scattered around the map, which keep a barrier in place around a boss that the defending team is ultimately trying to protect. In order for a stake to be raised, an attacking player has to stand on it in one position and hold that position for a length of time until it eventually hits its maximum height, and then once 2 of those stakes have been raised, then the barrier drops and the attacking team can go and actually do damage to the boss. After a certain length of time, the barrier will reactivate and the attacking team has to go back and raise the stakes again, and the boss has 2 health bars, so once the second one has been depleted, then the attacking team wins the match. If the defending team manages to prevent the attacking team from depleting the boss's full health, then they win the match. So while that is a straightforward mode, it's definitely not a standard one, so it's a shame that the only time you're ever really going to be able to play it it as if it's one of the modes that's in the Ninja World League rotation. They did also introduce a new mode later on with patches that was called Survival Exercise, and it's just a 6-player free-for-all. You win by racking up the most points, and you do that by staying alive and getting enemy eliminations, and that's it. So they really don't have a whole lot going on as far as the multiplayer mode is concerned, and to make matters worse, there are only 5 maps available in the game. And that's across both the single-player and co-op missions, as well as the multiplayer versus stuff. You can bump that number up to 6 technically by including the only map available in the survival exercise mode, but it's only available in the survival exercise mode, so I don't really think that counts. And that lack of maps is a pretty severe detriment for the game, because it means that every single mission is going to take place on one of the same 5 maps, and it's disproportionately weighted towards the Forest of Death and the Leaf Village. So you're going to be playing through those maps constantly in the missions mode, and then when you go over to the versus mode, you might get a bit more of the other maps, but even then, there's still the same maps that you were playing in the single-player and co-op missions, and there's really nothing all that special about them. They're just basically big open arenas for you to run around in. And even if you go through the single-player and co-op versions of those maps, they're exactly the same as the multiplayer versions, but maybe with some slight parameters with regards to the defensive missions or whatever the case may be. But even then, those barely change how the map looks and feels, so it all feels very copy-paste as a result. This does ultimately mean that the game leans very heavily on its core gameplay mechanics as well as its customization system. And I'll go ahead and talk about the customization system first, where at the beginning of the game you select a variety of customization options for your avatar. You can of course select male or female and then go from their outfits to their hairstyle, their hair and eye color, all that sort of thing. And as you play through the game, you'll gradually unlock new outfits as well as new hairstyles, face paints, all that sort of thing that you can equip to your character. And while you may not necessarily notice it, there are actually stat bonuses based on which outfits you're wearing, so you might want to keep an eye on that and make sure you select something that's really optimal to what you're trying to go for. But that said, the bonuses you get from equipment are so negligible they're almost unnoticeable for the most part, so it's really more about customizing the character to look the way you want them to look. And to that end, you do have a decent variety of outfits available to you, most of which are just copies of the various characters' outfits from the anime, but with a lot of color variations available. And if you like the way a particular outfit looks, but you don't necessarily like the stat bonuses it gives, then you can actually respec that using the in-game currency that you earn by simply playing the game. There's also a variety of weapons that you can equip that will each have their own individual stats, but they all behave in very similar ways to one another within a given class, and that's where the customization mixes with the actual mechanics, because there are 4 classes available for you to pick from. You have attack, range, defense, and heal. And each of them are pretty much what you would expect. The attack class is all about getting in close and doing a whole lot of melee attacks. Defense is really all about creating defensive jutsu as well as holding your ground. Ranged is all about keeping your distance and using powerful long-range attacks. And the heal class is really the general support class, but it's where all the major healing abilities for your team are. Each class has its own selection of weapons available to it, so for example the defense class gets all the big heavy weapons, whereas the attacking class dual wields short range weaponry. The healing class uses primarily swords, but it does have a few other things mixed in there as well. And the ranged class uses basically things that they can throw in one hand and do melee attacks within the other. Aside from basic weapons, each class also has a selection of ninja tools available, from things like basic throwing weapons to things that you can lay down for support purposes to either heal your team or immobilize the enemy or all sorts of things like that. And of course, each class also has a selection of jutsu available, although at the very beginning you're going to have very limited options for that because you need to learn the various jutsu from the VR masters. Basically, you select a VR master to train under, and as you continue to complete missions and of course complete versus matches, you'll gradually earn experience, and eventually your training level with that master will increase, allowing you access to new jutsu, new customization items, and eventually also scrolls, which are basically the game's version of loot boxes, although as far as I can tell you can't spend actual money on them. You just can get them with the in-game currency, or you just earn them by completing missions, and those will all just give you random customization items. Now, there are some problems with the way this system is set up. For one, you don't get anywhere near the level of customization that you did from the likes of, say, Dragon Ball Xenoverse, where you could equip basically any abilities that you wanted, and you could just customize your character to your heart's content. Here, you have exactly 2 normal jutsu, 1 ultimate jutsu, and a substitution jutsu, regardless of which class you're using. And the only jutsu you can pick across any class are the substitution jutsus. All the other jutsu are limited based on which class you're using. So if, for example, you really like the Rasengan, you have to play the attack class in order to use it. You can't use it as a ranged class or defense or heal. Whereas if you like spitting fireballs at enemies, then you have to play the ranged class because none of the other classes get access to that. Now, on the one hand, with a class system in place, that does make sense. It doesn't really make sense for, say, a heal class to be using a lot of offensive abilities. They would be more geared towards support. But at the same time, you would think that they would give you more options for your jutsu than simply 2 jutsus and an ultimate, because the ultimate takes a long time to charge, and while it is certainly very powerful, unfortunately, it takes long enough to charge where you might actually not be able to use it by the time the match ends. Apart from your ultimate jutsu, all your other jutsu and to a lesser degree your ninja tools are on cooldown timers, and the reason I say your ninja tools are a lesser degree is because some of them have multiple charges, so you can keep using them over and over again until all of your charges deplete, then you have to wait for the cooldown timer to expire before you can use them again. Aside from all of those abilities, you also have your basic melee attacks, which are light and heavy attacks, and the heavy attacks tend to be a lot slower and, of course, crush through guards, but they also leave you a lot more open for being hit. And then, of course, you can block, you can do jumps, you can do dodges, and if you hold down one of the buttons, you can also do a particularly long leap. Or if you press the button while in midair, you actually end up throwing out a kunai that will allow you to attach to a surface and then pull yourself to it. And when you get down to it, there's really not a lot of depth to the combat in this game whatsoever. It ends up becoming very spammy for the most part, particularly with people who have only picked up the game very recently and don't really know how it works. And even among the people who do know how it works, there's still just not a whole lot of depth to it, and it mostly ends up being a matter of just blocking until the enemy leaves themselves open, and then either throw a jutsu at them or just pummel them into submission. And for a game that's designed around fighting multiple enemies at once, it really doesn't do a very good job with the soft lock mechanics. I mean, the hard lock, where you actually deliberately press the button to lock onto an enemy, works most of the time, but it still spazzes out on occasion. And the soft lock, where you don't press that, but it still targets an enemy, ends up just spazzing all over the place, and more often than not, you'll end up attacking something that you didn't really mean to attack. So the core combat mechanics can end up being more frustrating than anything else, and when you bring everything together, you find that there's just not a whole lot on offer here. You go through the VR training missions, and then once you've hit a certain point, then you find that you're not getting any new missions, and once you've completed all the missions available to you, then it seems like the game ends. It plays the same cutscene it played at the beginning of the game, and then it plays the end credits, both of which are unskippable, by the way, and then it just kicks you back into the game, and it's like, congratulations, you're a Chunin now, and now you get access to all the A and S rank missions, which are all the same missions that you've already done, just with more enemies and higher difficulty, and that's not really all that compelling. And then, of course, you still have all the other VR masters that you can train under and get all of their jutsu, but then you're still limited to only 2 normal jutsu, a substitution, and an ultimate jutsu per class, although you do get multiple class loadouts that you can switch between. And what you ultimately end up with is really just not much more than an extremely low-effort cash grab. And you may think that the DLC really heavily expands upon the experience, but it doesn't. The Season Pass consisted of 9 VR Masters and 1 outfit, all for the price of $30 US. And if you decide you want a particular VR Master individually, then they want you to pay $4 US for it. It's frankly pretty insulting when you get down to it, and to make matters worse, now they're doing Season Pass 2, which is doing the exact same thing. It's 9 more VR Masters. They're not adding any substantial content in the game, they're not putting in new missions, they're not putting in new maps, not even really putting in new modes. It's just, here, have some more jutsu to play around with, probably most of which are going to be the same kind of stuff you've already been using in the base game, only with some slight tweaks here and there. And it's actually a real shame, because a game like Dragon Ball Xenoverse, but for the Naruto series, makes a whole lot of sense. It's got enough jutsu, it's got enough characters that you could learn under, it's got enough filler arc storyline crap going on that they could just basically do whatever they wanted with a storyline and somehow it would work. And as of Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2, we know that mechanically a game like that can actually work pretty decently. But what you have on display in Naruto to Boruto Shinobi Striker is just pathetic. And as a result, I can't give it anything more than a 1.5 out of 5. I mean, the game does function, but there's just so little on offer here that there's really no reason to bother with it at all. But hopefully they don't completely abandon the idea of doing a Dragon Ball Xenoverse style game, but with the Naruto series, because frankly, that would actually be pretty cool if they did it right. Unfortunately, Naruto to Boruto Shinobi Striker just doesn't do that right. Thanks for watching.